There's a certain arrogance that comes with climbing mountains. Not the bad kind necessarily. It's the quiet belief that preparation, skill, and determination can somehow tilt the odds in your favor against nature's most unforgiving terrain. And most of the time, that belief holds up. Climbers train for years, study routes obsessively, and wait for perfect weather windows. They do everything right, but mountains don't care about what's right. They operate on their own terms, indifferent to ambition, immune to human schedules. Manaslu understands this better than most. Standing at 8,163 meters in western Nepal, it's the 8th highest peak in the world. Unlike Everest with its crowds and commercial fame, Manaslu has always occupied a quieter space in mountaineering consciousness. It's known as a stepping stone, a proving ground for climbers who want to test themselves on an 8,000er before attempting the bigger names. Less technical than Annapurna, more accessible than K2. On paper, Manaslu looks almost forgiving, but paper doesn't account for the mountain's temperament. Manaslu's weather is notoriously brutal, its snowpack dangerously unstable, its terrain riddled with seracs and crevasses that swallow the careless and the careful alike. The mountain has always demanded respect. In September 2012, it demanded something far worse. That autumn, 231 climbers converged on Manaslu's slopes. It was the largest gathering the mountain had ever seen, driven there by circumstances beyond anyone's control. They came from Europe, North America, Asia. They came with experience, with Sherpa guides, with the best equipment money could buy. They pitched their tents at Camp 3, settled in for the night, and waited for dawn to continue their push toward the summit. Dawn never came the way they expected. At 4:30 a.m. on September 23rd, a massive serac broke loose from 7,400 meters above. What followed was the deadliest avalanche in mountaineering since 1996. 13 climbers would never leave that mountain, and the survivors would carry the weight of that morning for the rest of their lives. To understand how 231 climbers ended up on Manaslu that September, you have to understand what happened on the other side of the border. China had closed its access to Nepal, blocking the route to Cho Oyu, another popular 8,000er that climbers often use as preparation for Everest. Expedition teams that had spent months planning, training, and paying for permits suddenly found themselves with nowhere to go. So, they pivoted. Almost all of them turned to Manaslu. The result was unprecedented. 30 expedition groups totaling 231 permitted climbers, guides, and Sherpas converged on a single mountain during the autumn climbing season. It was the largest gathering Manaslu had ever seen. The base camp swelled with tents, equipment, and ambition. For a peak that usually attracted modest numbers, this was an overwhelming surge of human presence. Manaslu itself sits about 60 miles northwest of Kathmandu, occupying a vastly different terrain from Everest. To reach its summit, climbers must pass through 4 camps above base camp. Base camp rests at 4,900 meters. Camp 1 sits at 5,800 meters. Camp 2 at 6,400. Camp 3 at 6,800. And finally, Camp 4 at 7,450 meters, the launching point for summit attempts. But the numbers don't tell you what the mountain actually feels like. The stretch between Camps 1 and 2 is where Manaslu shows its teeth. The route winds through a labyrinth of towering seracs and deep crevasses, a frozen maze where one wrong step means disappearing into darkness. This section had earned a grim reputation over the years. Incidents were common. The terrain was unforgiving. Climbers who made it through always breathed a little easier once they reached the other side. Between Camps 2 and 3, the mountain relents slightly. The snow slope broadens, becomes easier to traverse. Above Camp 3, a subsidiary peak rises, and beyond it sits a large formation known as the North Col. From there, the route continues through 2 exhausting snow slopes and a small wall of seracs before the final push. On the night of September 22nd, the mountain was crowded. Camp 2 held 12 tents. Camp 3 held 25 tents and 31 climbers. These were people who had endured days of rain and snow to reach this elevation. They had passed through the most exposed and dangerous terrain below. Now, nestled in their sleeping bags at 6,800 meters, they felt something close to relief. The hardest part seemed behind them. The treacherous traverse was done. Tomorrow, they would continue upward, closer to the summit they had traveled thousands of miles to reach. What none of them knew was that 600 meters above their heads, a massive serac was hanging by a thread. And the mountain wasn't done with them yet. The disaster that struck Camp 3 didn't come without warning. The signs were there, written in the snow itself. But mountains have a way of revealing their intentions only in hindsight, when it's far too late to act on what should have been obvious. 10 days before the avalanche, a Canadian skier named Greg Hill was climbing with his German team at around 23,000 feet. What he found in the snowpack troubled him deeply. The base layer was decomposed, weak, structurally compromised. His team identified a specific area high on the mountain that concerned them most. It was the exact zone that would later become the epicenter of the slide. But at the time, Hill made a calculated judgment. There simply wasn't enough snow accumulated yet to pose an immediate threat. The weak layer existed, but the mass above it wasn't sufficient to trigger a catastrophic release. They noted the danger and moved on. That assessment changed dramatically over the following week. A severe storm descended on Manaslu, one of the most punishing the mountain had seen that season. For 7 straight days, snow fell relentlessly, not inches, feet. Several feet per day piling onto the slopes, loading weight onto that fragile, decomposed base layer like a slow-motion time bomb. The 231 climbers on the mountain had no choice but to retreat. They hunkered down at base camp, watching the skies, waiting for the storm to exhaust itself. When it finally cleared, nobody rushed back up. The avalanche risk was too obvious, too immediate. Teams waited 3 full days before attempting to return to the higher camps, hoping the snowpack would stabilize. It seemed like the cautious approach. It seemed like the right call. What made the situation even more dangerous was a decision that had been made weeks earlier, before anyone knew what was coming. Camp 3 had been established in a different location this year compared to previous seasons. Teams had placed it lower on the mountain than usual. At the time, the reasoning probably made sense. Perhaps the terrain was easier to access. Perhaps the weather conditions seemed favorable. But lower meant more exposed. Lower meant sitting directly in the path of anything that broke loose from the massive serac field above. The camp's new position transformed it from a relatively sheltered stopping point into a target. After enduring the storm and the anxious wait that followed, climbers began making their way back up the mountain. They pushed through rain and snow, traversed the dangerous section between Camps 1 and 2, and finally reached Camp 3. The relief was palpable. They had survived the exposed traverse. They were past the worst of it. On the evening of September 22nd, 31 climbers settled into their tents at Camp 3. Some prepared equipment for the next day's push. Others tried to sleep despite the altitude and the cold. Above them, unseen in the darkness, the weight of 7 days of snowfall pressed down on a foundation that could no longer hold. The mountain was about to collect its debt. 4:30 a.m., September 23rd, 2012. The climbers at Camp 3 were still in their sleeping bags when the mountain above them collapsed. A massive serac, a towering block of glacial ice, broke free from 7,400 meters. It didn't fall alone. It triggered an avalanche that came roaring down the main climbing route, gathering speed and mass across 600 meters of vertical descent. The wall of snow and ice hit Camp 3 with devastating force. It crushed tents flat. It ripped others from their anchors and hurled them down the slope. All 25 tents at Camp 3 were destroyed in seconds. Below, at Camp 2, the blast wave shattered several more tents and dragged some of them several hundred meters down the mountain. This was the worst mountaineering disaster since 1996. Somehow, the climbers at Camp 2 survived. Their tents were damaged, some destroyed entirely, but no one suffered serious injuries. They emerged into the pre-dawn darkness to a scene of absolute chaos. Somewhere above them, buried under tons of debris, 31 people needed help. Those who could move began the desperate work immediately. They dug through snow, called out for survivors, tried to locate anyone still alive beneath the surface. The challenge was overwhelming. Nobody knew exactly how many people were buried or where to look. In the darkness, with limited equipment and altitude sapping their strength, rescuers focused on whoever they could reach. When dawn finally broke, the full horror became visible. Pieces of tents were scattered across the slope like confetti. Bodies lay exposed on the snow. Some survivors had been carried 1,000 feet down the mountain by the force of the slide. A few emerged from the wreckage with barely a scratch. Others had suffered fatal internal injuries and were dying even as help arrived. The scenes at ground level were nightmarish. Some climbers were found lying on top of debris while the tent next to them remained completely buried under suffocating weight. Others were trapped inside their own tents, unable to move, surrounded by the bodies of teammates who hadn't survived the impact. For 5 agonizing hours, survivors worked without outside assistance. They pulled people from the snow. They held the hands of friends who were slipping away. They watched companions die beside them, unable to do anything but grieve. Between rescues, they carved a platform into the slope, a makeshift helipad for the helicopters they prayed would come. The injured were gathered near the landing zone. Those who could be moved were carried down. Those who couldn't were kept as warm as possible with whatever gear remained intact. All the while, teams continued searching for the missing. Every few minutes, someone would call out a name into the frozen silence, hoping for a response that often never came. Bodies were excavated from the debris and laid carefully on the snow. By mid-morning, the survivors had done everything humanly possible. Now, they needed help from below. At 9:45 a.m., the first helicopter appeared over the ridge. A Serac Air B-3, one of the few aircraft capable of operating at such extreme altitude, touched down on the platform survivors had carved from the snow. The rescue operation had finally begun. The wounded were loaded first. Those with the most critical injuries were flown directly to base camp, where an improvised treatment center had been established in the hours since the avalanche. Larger expedition groups had mobilized quickly, carrying stretchers, oxygen tanks, and medical supplies down to the helipad. From base camp, the most severe cases were airlifted further to Samagaan, then onward to hospitals in Kathmandu. 3 helicopter companies answered the call that day. Serac Air and Fishtail Air dispatched aircraft from both Pokhara and Kathmandu, their pilots pushing the limits of what their machines could handle. The weather was marginal, the altitude was punishing, but the crews kept flying. Meanwhile, additional helicopters fanned out across the outlying slopes, searching for climbers who had been swept far from the camp's original location. The avalanche had scattered people across a vast debris field, and nobody knew with certainty how many were still missing. The conditions were too dangerous for police rescue teams to participate. The altitude was simply too high, the terrain too technical. Only experienced high-altitude personnel, Sherpas and guides who knew Manaslu intimately, were called upon to assist in the ground search. By the time the sun began to set, the grim arithmetic of the disaster had become clear. 31 people had been caught in the avalanche. 9 bodies had been recovered from the debris. 4 climbers remained missing and were presumed dead. 13 lives lost in a single catastrophic moment. The survivors owed their lives to 18 flights conducted throughout the day. 14 of those were evacuation missions, ferrying the injured off the mountain, 1 helicopter load at a time. The dead came from across the world. Climbers from Nepal, Spain, Italy, Germany, and France were among the victims. 1 Canadian mountaineer was never found, lost somewhere in the vast frozen wreckage. The nationalities of the dead told a story of their own. Most of the fatalities had occurred among European teams positioned at Camp 3. They had traveled thousands of miles, spent months preparing, invested everything in reaching this summit. The mountain had other plans. On September 24th, the search resumed. Helicopters returned to the slopes, joined by searchers on foot, conducting a final sweep for the missing. The last of the recoverable bodies were brought down. By late afternoon, deteriorating weather forced an end to operations. The search was officially called off. What remained on Manaslu was silence. The tents were gone, buried or shredded. The climbers were gone, evacuated, or dead. Only the mountain remained, indifferent as ever, its slopes still loaded with the snow that had killed so many just hours before. The 2012 autumn season was over. The reckoning was just beginning. In the weeks and months that followed, interviews with rescue workers and experienced Manaslu guides painted a clearer picture of what had gone wrong. The camp placement, the unstable snowpack, the unprecedented snow accumulation from a week of storms. Each factor alone might have been manageable. Together, they created a death trap that no amount of skill or preparation could escape. But the 2012 disaster also forced a harder conversation about what's changing in high-altitude mountaineering. Ang Charing of the Kathmandu-based Asian Trekking Agency had organized hundreds of expeditions over his career. He'd watch the mountains transform, low snow levels followed by sudden massive dumps, unpredictable weather windows, more climbers competing for fewer safe days. On Manaslu, he said, there wasn't much danger before. That's no longer the case. Some mountaineers blame global warming for the worsening conditions they've faced in recent years. Whether that's the full explanation or not, the evidence on the peaks themselves is hard to ignore. Seracs that once seemed stable are calving more frequently. Snowpacks that held firm for decades are collapsing without warning. The mountains haven't changed their height, but they've changed their temperament. Since 2012, Manaslu has continued to claim lives. Dozens of fatalities have accumulated in the years since, cementing its reputation as one of the most dangerous 8,000ers. The stepping stone has become a graveyard for those who underestimate it. And yet, climbers keep coming. They always will. The pull of high places is too strong for warnings to extinguish, too fundamental to human restlessness. Perhaps that's not arrogance after all. Perhaps it's something closer to acceptance, the understanding that some pursuits carry risks that cannot be eliminated, only managed. On the morning of September 23, 2012, management wasn't enough. 13 people went to sleep, dreaming of the summit, and never woke to see it. The mountain kept what it wanted. If you've ever wondered what drives people to climb, despite knowing the dangers, drop your thoughts below. And hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next disaster story we cover.